is one that I am excited for, very excited for. Our next speaker is Steve Hiltner, and Steve is he is a hive mind regarding invasive species, and communicating with the public about invasive species and why it's so important. He's also done excellent writing in defense of the attack on invasive species, if that makes sense. So without further ado, I'd like to, I'm excited to hear from Steve Hiltner about the skewed logic of defenders of invasive species.
Right, well, let's see. Can you hear me?
Heard.
See if I can get this up here. Can everybody see that?
Got it.
That looking good?
Looking good.
All right, well, thanks to NCIPC for having me here, and board member Perry Sugg is a good friend of mine, and from back when I lived in Durham. I'm something of an outlier. I live in Princeton, New Jersey now, but we're still in the Piedmont, so I still feel, connection through the soil, I guess, to Durham, and I still come down a couple times a year to do some work with native plants. When I was in Durham, I started the Ellerby Creek Watershed Association back in 1999, and we created some preserves and did a lot of invasive species work to make those places, to open them up so we could have trails. And those were right in the city, which was part of the concept, so that people could see, experience a nature walk without having to drive out of town. And I've done similar things up in Princeton, started a nonprofit up here. We take care of a couple hundred acres of publicly owned land and do some invasive species work. So I've been doing it quite a bit, and kind of living, all the people I know have, think it's a good thing that to be working on countering the spread of invasive species, and it's always been obvious in the field that they are a real threat. So it was kind of a surprise just some examples. In Princeton, places that aren't being taken care of. This is porcelainberry taking over the Princeton battlefield. That was a key battle in the Revolutionary War. Now being taken over by porcelainberry. They mow the lawn, but they don't take care of anything else. We'll hear more about this in Perry's talk. Lesser celandine, that is really traumatizing homeowners as it spreads yard to yard in town, and people feel helpless as that takes over. Here is Phragmites, we have a beautiful marsh in Princeton. It was being taken over by Phragmites, and this is something of a success story. We've been able to really knock that out, and we're doing enough follow-up, I think, to keep it from coming back. But this is what it looked like when the Phragmites was really taking over. This is a bird mecca, so it's really important to maintain the habitat. You can see Phragmites is, you aren't going to be able to pull this out. You need herbicide, and that's a big issue with invasive species denial is a real dislike of herbicide, and we use herbicide. So if you don't like the solution, you try to pretend the problem doesn't exist. So here's, of course, stiltgrass. We have just huge areas of stiltgrass in Princeton, as in North Carolina. So, and of course, emerald ash borer finally made it to us, and hundreds of thousands of trees dead. So in that context, it just seems so clear that invasive species are a problem, and also dealing with them is can be kind of fun and community building. Here they used herbicide to kill the turf grass in a detention basin. And we planted it with native species and came up with a beautiful native meadow that still takes, periodic strategic upkeep, but it's just a wonderful native meadow full of wildflowers and native grasses, where it was just lawn before. So there's, we've had some success stories, and, it came as a considerable surprise to see I read the New York Times, and periodically there'd be an opinion piece talking about kind of demonizing people like us, people who are, trying to restore habitat. They thought that invasive species are really not a problem, and that we are awful people, and there's a lot of smearing, calling us xenophobic and elitist and sentimental and nativist, a lot of words flying around, coming in our direction. So I just listed some of the opinion pieces, and I do a lot of writing. So I started really picking apart this argument that invasive species are supposedly not a problem after all, and that it's some kind of xenophobia to be favoring native plants. And so I posted a lot of those. I started blogging in 2006. And I also would send the critiques to the editors. And I was just, they weren't fact checking. They were publishing a bunch of stuff that just was really poorly thought out. And I wanted to make that clear to the people who make decisions. So that's one thing I started. And then a friend gave me this book, Beyond the War on Invasive Species. And she was really excited by this book. She thought it was great. And this friend and I have similar sympathies. And I thought, wow, well, that's okay. I'll take a look. And to my surprise, it was just an awful, very poorly thought out book. And it was trying to say that, there's this war on invasive species perpetrated by people like us. And we have to stop hating invasive species and try to figure out how to get along. And at the same time, the book was creating, the concept of the other, the despised other. You create some enemy that you need to hate. Well, the author here, Tara Ryan, was basically making us seem like people that were worthy of hate. So she was creating another. At the same time, she was saying we really need to stop demonizing. So there's a lot of hypocrisy. And part of the complaint in this book and also in the opinion pieces was that invasiveness is a term from warfare. Now, we should not be calling species invasive, because that's as if we're at war with nature. So she thought that was wrong. And a big part of her motivation is that she is against using herbicides. And this is, a case where, and it happens with climate change too. If you don't like collective effort to solve problems, then you're going to deny the problem. And that's essentially what she does. She pretends that invasive plants aren't a problem. And also she's coming from this perspective of permaculture, which I had always had very positive associations with. But the view that she perpetrates, at least, is that nature is healthy, that any problems in nature are symptoms of something deeper. So if a plant is spreading like crazy, it's a symptom that nature is out of balance, and we have to heal nature overall, and then that plant that's spreading won't be a problem. So it was I don't know. I was very surprised, because I had respect for permaculture. I was very surprised that permaculturists, David Holmgren is one of the founders of permaculture. He really launches into attacking habitat restoration in his forward to the book. And I was just stunned. And there's also a problem with terminology. Um, we have to be pretty clear, you know, invasiveness is a behavior. I think cattails can be pretty invasive. You know, we try to keep them out of some of our wetlands here in Princeton because otherwise they take over and you can't have the sedges and you know, the hibiscus and all that. They just get overwhelmed by this native cattail. So I feel that invasive is a behavior, and we have to make clear that you know, mostly the most serious invasives are non-native. But not all non-natives are invasive. So we have to be very clear about that kind of thing. And another thing that crops up very frequently in this kind of literature is they'll find one positive thing about a plant, and like it has a pretty flower, or it fixes nitrogen, so it improves the soil. And that somehow absolves all the negative traits, which to me makes no sense. But there you go. One of the earliest books preceding the war on invasive species was Emma Maris's Rambunctious Garden. That came along, I think, in 2011. Now, Douglas Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home, came out in 2007. So all the people who wrote these books trying to say that invasive species are okay after all, they had 4 years to notice, you know, Douglas Tallamy's book, but he doesn't get mentioned in these books pretty much. So there's a lot of just exclusion of data that might contradict the message, this climate change denial message. Now, Emma Maris particularly liked to mock national parks. She would sometimes characterize them as sickly ecosystems nursed by park rangers. And she was trying to contrast that with novel ecosystems, which just sort of spring up, you know, what we'd call weeds in like urban lots and backyards and things. And she thought those were much more exciting, and she claimed that they're much more diverse than actual parks, you know, national parks. She can, it's an interesting read, I would say. She's an interesting writer, but at the same time, she is using, you know, words to demonize people like us, reflexively hostile, militaristic, obsessive, hating. Invasion biologists are a particular enemy, target, because they're scientists, and yet a lot of these books refer to them as scientists who are very emotional and swayed, you know, swayed by their emotions, sentimental, whatever. So that happens. Emma Maris came out with a TED Talk, and I listened to it closely, and the aha moment in that TED Talk is when she says that somebody let their yard go, and 2 years later it had 275 species of plants. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. And then I did some research to find out whether that was actually true, and it turned out that she had misquoted, that it was 275 species of animals and plants. And if you think about all the fauna and flora in the soil, you quickly come up with 275 species, even if you don't have that many kinds of plants. So I communicated with her, and she made some changes in the website, but of course she couldn't change the TED Talk. So there's, you know, the false presentations are out there. Let's see. A lot of this goes back, interestingly, to Michael Pollan, a great writer, fascinating books. He was writing for the New York Times back in the 1990s, and in 1994, he was criticized. One of his columns was criticized by people who advocate native plants, and it got Pollan kind of angry. And he wrote this polemic against nativism, what he called nativism. And if you look at it, a lot of the themes that have come in the 25 years after that are all in his opinion piece in the New York Times. He uses words like nativism and xenophobic, and at some point says crypto-fascist, though he doesn't actually say we are, he just says he hopes we're not, which is generous. He exaggerates goals. This is a classic thing, to exaggerate goals. So turning back the ecological clock to 1492 is a fool's errand. And that variations on that sentence come up over and over and over in this literature. Obviously, we're not trying to get back to 1492. We understand that's impossible. We're trying to reduce the impact of invasive species, but if you try to make it sound like we're purists and want to eradicate invasive species, then of course that's impossible, and they can say we're doing foolish things. Chemical dependence, he mentions that. So, the whole bugaboo of using herbicides, that's continuing to be a big deal. And I hope I have time just at the end of the talk to discuss the whole thing of how we use chemical herbicides, but we don't like to talk about it because so many environmentalists are trying to say those are all poisons. Let's see. Oh, and when does a introduced species become accepted as a native species? Well, I don't see nature dealing with a lot of these species that were introduced even centuries ago. They're still highly invasive. And interestingly, in his essay, he really doesn't talk about ecology. Now, this is 1994, and we can't really, Ptolemy hadn't come out, back in 1994, things were not as well known as they're known now. But nature really doesn't get its due in a lot of these things, a lot of this literature. And, Pollan takes umbrage at the thought that his garden has to help out nature. So that was back in 1994. I don't know, maybe he's changed his mind, but I'm not sure. So the 25 years after Pollan's column, these are some of the books on the left. I also realized that there was a very influential website coming out of San Francisco called Million Trees. And that there was a big controversy about eucalyptus trees, which I hadn't known about. Eucalyptus trees are, of course, native to Australia, and native plant advocates in California wanted to bring back the largely herbaceous meadows that had been there before all these eucalyptus trees were introduced. And cutting down the eucalyptus trees became a huge controversy, and Million Trees fed on all that controversy, and it was very aggressive in commenting on whatever articles came out countrywide. So that had a big influence. And maybe You Bet Your Garden. I think it's out of Philadelphia, but it's a jovial fellow who takes questions on gardening. And I started looking at some of his stuff, and he's no expert, but he was pretending he was an expert on and saying that invasive plants aren't a problem, that his wife loves multiflora rose and therefore it's okay, that sort of thing. So I was able to actually correspond with him a little bit, and I hope he softened his tone. I haven't tracked him since then, but I have reached out to some of these people. I did have a correspondence with the woman beyond the War on Invasive Species. We went back and forth, and I think, I feel like I've reached some of these people, but who knows? So anyway, a lot of books, websites, radio, it comes at people in a lot of different ways. Here was one just incredible, um, claiming to be optimistic that we should be able to do anything we want. We're a natural part of the ecosystem, being humans. And so everything we do, presumably nuclear holocaust, is natural. And he said everything's going to be fine in a million years. A useful thing to do with these kind of arguments is say, well, are we approaching things like inequality and racism in the same way? Can we tell women, well, in a million years, you'll have all your rights. So that should be, you should be happy. I mean, are we really, things that are said about nature, we have to be thinking about how that fits with our views about other issues. I did have a professional review published in Biological Invasions of Inheritors of the Earth, and I also have one on my website at News Companion. So counterweight to all this stuff is Daniel Simberloff has carried a lot of weight in terms of responding, trying to counter these arguments. And of course, Talamy, they're so important to have them, but I don't think it's enough. People aren't, if the people who are outside of our bubble are not reading these books, then what do we do? So I started looking at Amazon. A lot of these books are highly rated. So you have the choir there, the 5-star choir. And then I also looked, you can look at the 1-star reviews, but what Amazon has done is they've slowly stripped the possibility of breaking people's bubbles. You can no longer say that a review is unhelpful. You can only say it's helpful. The negative reviews, they tend to make more prominent the top negative review is just false. It's not the top review. Oftentimes it's the weakest criticism they can find, and they present that as the top critical review. So it's getting harder to break people's bubbles on this stuff. Amazon was a great way to do it at one time, but you can't even comment on other people's reviews anymore. So it's getting more and more limited. They want to sell books. So I want to leave a little time here for discussion. A big problem, not only in our area, but politically, is that people think they're tough-minded if they're being skeptical of other people, but oftentimes they're not skeptical of themselves. So there needs to be skepticism aimed inward. And that, that's like immunizing. It's like a vaccine for lies. And it's not happening because, people need to be more like scientists. They need to be thinking skeptical, not only of others people's work, but their own. And also, a lot of these writers are not scientists. And the people who review their books in like the New York Times, Washington Post, are not scientists either. So there's a lot of vulnerability to false information, books being praised that really are not very good. Herbivory is, a lot of it just comes down to, if nothing's eating the leaves, that's a problem. They may get food from the flowers and the seeds, but if these plants aren't actually being eaten by herbivores, then that creates the imbalance. I don't know. Rate of change is another thing that they often miss. They say that, well, everything's changing, like the climate's changing, and change has always happened. But it's the rate of change that's so important, and that's what we're trying to fight is the rate of change of the world. And just quickly, I do want to say about herbicides. I've really come to think that we need to think about herbicides as medicines, because nature is not like an organic farm. The invasive plants are embedded within a complex system, much like pathogens are embedded in our bodies. And we need to think of herbicides as a kind of medicine that's used minimally, intelligently, in a targeted way. And I think if we start talking about it in that fashion, then we can actually be more open about what we're doing and why we do it. So just quickly, I just can't say enough about how invasive species have actually been very involved in my creating nonprofits. My early work has been dealing with areas that were overwhelmed by invasive species, and we make beautiful areas for people to witness nature out of that. So there's been a lot of positive things happening. So thank you very much.
Steve, thank you. That was a great talk. I really appreciate you being here, and I love the slide before this last one about reframing herbicides as medicine. I mean, I really do think that is a really appropriate parallel to reach people on a more human level. And I haven't thought about that before, about drawing that parallel. So I really appreciate you making that point. There was a comment from Johnny Randall in the Q&A, and he was asking if you are familiar with one of a book or a work that kind of got the whole sham started. It's called Invasion Biology: Critique of a Pseudoscience by David Theodoropoulos. Have you heard of that?
Oh, I think I've heard of that. Oh, when did it come out?
2003. So it's a long while ago.
Okay. Yeah, I should check that out. Oh my goodness.
No, I mean, I think that's just I'm not familiar with that work, but I mean, I imagine that that at that early on in the stage, a piece of critical writing like that could really start the game of telephone. And I think that was another point that I thought about in my head, was that the example of the misquote from the TED Talk. I mean, how these little bits of information or misinformation, I don't necessarily think it was disinformation in that context, but misinformation become reverberated through our various like telephone channels, social media, especially now. And so things that are not facts at all are A, not scrutinized, and B, proliferated in these channels and echo chambers. And so that is a real big concern in trying to head off the generation of this information, and it's because once it gets out, it spreads so far and wide so quickly that undoing that kind of damage is difficult.
Yeah, and I think the next challenge is, the attempts to ban herbicides. I tried to buy glyphosate, and they're back ordered, because of the lawsuit, and I really think we need to change that conversation. I'm looking forward to tomorrow's presentation on glyphosate, and I don't know what it's going to be about, but maybe it'll cover some of these aspects of the demonization and what's true and what's not.
Yeah, I've heard Dr. Gannon speak before, and that was several years ago. So I imagine it's only gotten better from here. And it probably will cover things like that. I think it's a good point, is especially specific to glyphosate, that I always try to spell out to people is, the use of glyphosate for conservation purposes to, promote native ecosystems and retain their ecosystem integrity, versus the use of glyphosate as like a tractor, on massive farms. I think that people conflate those two ideas, so glyphosate just becomes demonized. And so perhaps that's something we can explore at like a next symposium, is maybe someone talking about, the role of glyphosate in the conservation world. Well, Steve, thank you so much. I really appreciate your presentation. And folks, if you have any other questions, again, we will make contact information available, and you can reach out. So before we switch to our next presenter, I just want to remind everyone that the Google form is in the chat, and to verify and validate your presence here for CEU purposes, please open that form up in between each presentation, answer the questions real quick, and you'll be good. So awesome. Thanks, Steve. So moving on to our next